Florence Chadwick. The water around Florence Chadwick looked almost black. Cold fog swallowed the Pacific Ocean so completely that rescue boats could barely see a few feet ahead. Somewhere beneath that freezing water, sharks moved through the current, and for nearly 16 straight hours, Chadwick kept swimming. Every muscle in her body was shutting down. Her lips were blue. Her shoulders felt like they were tearing apart. Crew members beside her begged her to stop before hypothermia killed her, but Chadwick refused. She had already conquered the English Channel. Now she wanted something even harder, swimming from Catalina Island to the California coast. The fog kept getting thicker. That was the real enemy. Not the sharks, not the freezing water, the fog. Because eventually Chadwick couldn't see land anymore. She couldn't see progress. She couldn't even tell if she was close. Panic started creeping in. After hours of brutal waves and exhaustion, she finally gave up and climbed into the boat. Then came the shocking moment. The shoreline appeared through the fog. She had stopped less than a mile from land. Most people would never return after a defeat like that. But 2 months later, Florence Chadwick came back, entered the same freezing water again, and this time she finished the swim, breaking records and proving that sometimes the mind gives up long before the body does. Lynne Cox. The ocean between Alaska and the Soviet Union was basically liquid ice. No wetsuit, no heated gear, just a swimsuit, a cap, and 40-degree water that could stop a human heart within minutes. That's exactly where Lynne Cox decided to swim. In 1987, during the peak of Cold War tension, Cox stepped into the deadly waters of the Bering Strait. Around her, giant chunks of floating ice drifted through the current. Her breathing immediately became violent and shallow. The cold stabbed through her chest like knives. But the danger wasn't just physical. Nobody knew how Soviet soldiers would react when an American swimmer suddenly appeared near their border. Armed patrol boats watched from a distance as Cox fought wave after wave in silence. Minutes turned into hours. Her body temperature kept dropping. Her hands became numb. At one point, she reportedly lost feeling in parts of her arms entirely. Most swimmers would have blacked out long before reaching the halfway point. But somehow Lynne Cox kept moving. When she finally reached Soviet territory, something unbelievable happened. Instead of hostility, Soviet citizens welcomed her from the shoreline. For a brief moment during one of the coldest political periods in history, a single swimmer crossing freezing water helped ease tensions between two superpowers. And she survived one of the most dangerous swims ever attempted. Jessica Long. At just 18 months old, doctors amputated both of Jessica Long's legs below the knee. For most people, that would become the defining tragedy of their life. For Jessica Long, it became the beginning of something almost impossible. As a child, she constantly fell while learning to walk on prosthetic legs. Every step hurt. Every movement took effort. But once she entered the water, everything changed. Suddenly, she wasn't limited anymore. In the pool, she could move faster than anyone expected. Then came the brutal training. Early mornings, endless laps, burning shoulders, cramping muscles, pressure that most teenagers could never handle. Behind the medals and interviews was constant physical pain and emotional exhaustion, and the stakes kept getting bigger. At the Paralympics, entire races were decided by fractions of a second. One bad turn, one missed breath, one tiny mistake could destroy years of work. Yet every time Jessica Long touched the wall, she kept proving people wrong. She became one of the most decorated Paralympic swimmers in American history. But what made her story powerful wasn't just survival in the water. It was surviving doubt, surviving isolation, surviving every moment where the world expected her to stop dreaming, smaller instead of bigger. And somehow she turned all of it into strength. Gertrude Ederle. The English Channel had already defeated countless men. Violent tides, freezing currents, sudden storms. Swimmers vanished into those waters completely exhausted, dragged away before ever reaching shore. Then Gertrude Ederle showed up. In 1926, millions of people followed her attempt to cross the Channel from France to England. Nobody knew if a woman could survive conditions that brutal. Even her own support crew feared the sea was becoming too dangerous. The water temperature kept dropping as waves slammed directly into her face. Salt water burned her throat and eyes. Hours passed, then more hours. At times, currents pushed her backward so violently it looked like she wasn't moving at all. But Ederle refused to quit. Fishing boats sounded their horns as crowds gathered along the shore, waiting for updates. America became obsessed with her survival. Then came the final nightmare. Near the English coast, the tides turned chaotic. One wrong angle could pull her away after more than 14 hours in the water. Exhausted and barely able to speak, Ederle pushed forward anyway. And suddenly, through the crashing surf, she reached land. Not only had she survived the channel, she shattered the previous record by nearly 2 hours. Overnight, Gertrude Ederle became one of the most famous women in the world. Louis Pugh. The water was so cold it looked deadly before he even touched it. Chunks of Arctic ice floated around. Louis Pugh as he prepared for another impossible swim. Scientists warned that prolonged exposure could trigger immediate hypothermia. Some feared cardiac arrest within minutes. Pugh entered anyway. The first shock was unbearable. His body instantly started fighting for survival. Breathing became chaotic. His fingers stiffened almost immediately. But the deeper he swam into the freezing Arctic water, the more dangerous things became. Ice shifted around him. Currents changed suddenly. One mistake could trap him between floating ice sheets with no escape. But Louis Pugh wasn't doing this for records alone. He wanted the world to see what was happening to the planet's oceans and melting polar regions. Every brutal swim became a message. Still, awareness didn't reduce the danger. During some swims, his body temperature dropped so low that recovery crews had to act fast to prevent collapse once he exited the water. Even speaking became difficult after prolonged exposure, yet he kept returning to the coldest waters on Earth. Because for Louis Pugh, survival itself became part of the protest. Every stroke through freezing oceans proved how far a human being could push the limits of endurance before nature finally pushed back. Matt Mauser. For Matt Mauser, survival didn't happen in the water. It happened after everything fell apart. In January 2020, a helicopter carrying his wife, Christina Mauser, crashed into thick fog in California. There were no survivors. The tragedy shocked the entire country. Overnight, Matt Mauser went from husband and father to a man forced to explain the unimaginable to his children. The silence after the crash became its own kind of nightmare. Interviews, headlines, grief, endless reminders of the moment his life changed forever. Most people watching from the outside saw public appearances and speeches. What they didn't see were the quiet moments afterward, the empty rooms, the panic, the exhaustion of trying to stay strong while emotionally drowning. But instead of disappearing, Mauser kept moving forward. He spoke publicly about loss. He honored his wife's legacy. He fought through grief while raising his children and rebuilding a life that no longer looked anything like before. That's what made his story a survival story. Not storms, not freezing oceans, but surviving devastating loss without letting it destroy the people still depending on you. And sometimes that kind of survival is the hardest of all.